So STAR for grazing lands is necessarily different, given the fact that plants don't move around the landscape. So these become a little more convoluted. Here, I'll give an abbreviated version, and I will go fairly quickly so that we can get you guys out and through your day. We will have, there is a grazing land specific training that'll be happening that you'll see later here in the slides. I just think, you know, managing a thinking animal that moves around the landscape makes for a not necessarily more challenging, but different, and much more difficult to score. So STAR for grazing lands is really focused more on the process of decision making and incentivizes planning, monitoring, and adaptive decision making. So when we've been through 3 iterations of grazing lands, and you know, when we first came at this, we were trying to look at practices, and realizing that practices from day to day, week to week, year to year were so fluid depending on where you were and what the weather was doing and how your land was responding and all that stuff. We kind of left the practice base behind and focused on a process-based system. And so this deviates a little bit from the cropping lands and what you might see in Illinois, for example. But this really allows us to assess, you know, the largest agricultural systems in the state, right? The rangelands and grazing lands that you know, our Colorado cattle call home. And I think that ultimately this will be the tool that takes STAR into the arid West, where, you know, it otherwise would be hampered. Like Helen had mentioned before, this is consistent with the STAR goal of rewarding producer effort. You know, these are really diverse and difficult to assess year on year, month on month. But you know, we can do everything right, and if it doesn't rain, it's really difficult. And so we didn't want to make things punitive, and the easiest way to do that is kind of looking at, is there a reference site nearby? And so that's sort of when we get into grazing lands, more of the training later. We'll be talking about things like land PKS and how do we assess what the range looks like, not compared to somebody else or something else, but to that area, right? For example, we had some incredible monsoon flows middle of last year. It didn't affect the entire state. So, you know, given that, it would be hard to look at Northeast Colorado and Southeast Colorado and, you know, let's say South Central Colorado and try and compare 3 different ranches, given the diversity of the climate last year across the state. And unlike the STAR for croplands, we really can apply this across the whole operation. We at CDA focus on the privately held stuff, right? The leases that folks have on state forests and federal lands and things of BLM land, things of that nature. We would hope that everything that we're doing in STAR meshes with you know, we don't want to uproot somebody's management plan for BLM, for example. And so hopefully we can get these to mesh together. That would be the ideal. This came together with a lot of hard work and a lot of people involved. It was developed by a committee of rangeland specialists from the USDA, NRCS, ARS, CSU Extension, soil scientists, state agencies, consultants, and producers with additional feedback. We had more than 10 producers involved, just in the committee alone. And then Helen and I, you know, thousands of miles under the tires and hundreds of hours later, we had visited 8 ranches. Each consultation took somewhere between 3 and 4 hours, just getting feedback from ranchers across the state as far as what questions should we be asking, what should we be focused on. in this outreach program that we had, that's when, one big change came on day one. Going into it, we were looking at monitoring as more of a long-term goal-oriented type deal. How is this going to influence your decision making over time? And what we quickly found out was that, producers are making decisions day to day, and moving animals accordingly. So that every time we went out and spoke with somebody, we refined it until we had less edits coming back. Some of the people that we had on the outreach were, Nick Charchalis, who's a CACD board member, Philip Anderson from Colorado Cattlemen's. We had a Leopold Conservation Award winner, a Crowley County rancher, who, as we all know, that's a dry county, and Robbie LaValle, who for years, has been so involved in ranching and ranching education. We obviously couldn't talk to everybody, but we talked to a lot of people, trying to get this all metered out in a good way. So we'll go through the major sections for star grazing lands, which includes the management plan, the grazing plan, record keeping, drought management, drought preparedness and response, and monitoring. The additional training for STAR is going to be on February 10th from 2 to 4, and we'll be sending out an invitation for that. So the management plan really guides our overall decision making, and whether that's a full-blown NRCS conservation plan that's written, typed out, all that stuff, we decided didn't have to be necessary, right? Codifying it, writing things down, even if it's on the back of a napkin, is still really beneficial and powerful for when people have to make decisions. And I can't remember who Helen attributed it to, but she's often fond of saying, you want to make your drought plan when it's raining outside, right? You don't want to be overly emotional when it comes to that stuff, and thinking clearly helps out when times do get tight. And so what we heard from producers was, if you can have that stuff written down, that'll just leave you in a better place to make decisions later on down the road. We do incentivize a written management plan, although it's not necessary. If you go through the grazing land forms, which I believe should be up or will be up soon, we do incentivize the written form, but that doesn't mean that there aren't any points allowed for folks that just, have a history and do it by memory. So another thing that we really incentivize in the written plan is who's involved, what the monitoring protocol is, your resource inventory, and the time of last review. And I think what we're looking for there is, if your written management plan was written by, a consultant, for example, but nobody else was involved, we run across on a couple of occasions where, folks just don't know what's in their conservation plan or their management plan. And some were even unaware that they had certain documents. And so NRCS was really helpful with that, because they do take very good records. What they found was that, when they reached out to their NRCS office, a lot of these things were available to them that they didn't realize was available to them. So again, as we start this conversation, part of it is, what do you have, and where do I go get those documents, because they might already exist. But the important takeaway there is that even non-written plans can still get points. And again, who's involved and things of that nature. Property mapped, really, we've seen everything from, ArcGIS maps to things that have been handwritten, maps that were drawn out on large pieces of like butcher paper and stuff like that. So, your monitoring protocol, your resource inventory, and how often you review your management plan. These are all really important. And if we were to go through the scoring sheet, you would see how those all ranked out. Within the management plan, usually there's a grazing plan, right? That's important, helps us determine, stocking rates and duration and all that. We're heavily incentivizing a written grazing plan and grazing plans in general. Like the management plan, there doesn't need to be a particular format. The resource inventory is of great importance. The process to assess land health, we will go through more at the next training, but use of the reference condition is ideal, and that's really what allows us to assess that land, right? Again, we want to be comparing, something up in Colorado First to something that's nearby in Colorado First, as opposed to something that's, in the Purgatory Spanish Peaks, for example, right? Different systems and need to be assessed differently. So it's important that we use those reference sites where available. Your periods of grazing, deferment, and yearly review of your grazing plan are really important. And the monitoring plan that comes later is critical in helping you make those decisions in your grazing plan prior to actually being in the season. And then again, timing of the last review, there is this temporal component. Have you updated things since 1992 or 2001? Year on year, things have gotten a little bit drier, and species might have changed. Droughts might be a little bit longer where you're at. All those things are going to affect your monitoring plan. And then the frequency of adjusting the grazing schedule, taking all these tools into account and making those decisions where necessary. Again, there's still points that can be assessed and processes to assess land health, even if things aren't written down. Record keeping, why it's important. What happened 10 years ago can have an impact. Ava, one of the things we talked about earlier, we were talking about soil building and soil loss. Many of the ranches I've been to, especially in the mountains of Colorado, were denuded by sheep 100 years ago. And so the A horizon in the soil is gone. The carbon just didn't disappear, right? The soil actually left the site, right? Without anything holding it in place. Those rain events and those snow events and the wind actually just pulled it off the soil surface and moved it into the rivers and streams and lakes and blew it to Kansas and all types of things. But what took place over the course of probably decades is going to take thousands of years to replace, right? Now, that's not to say we can't have a positive impact on the landscape. It's just saying that A horizon that might have been this thick will take thousands of years to rebuild. So, but we can still make positive impacts on our soil and get better infiltration and aggregation and build carbon and things like that and start to, supercharge that process. But it's important. Record keeping is important because it allows us to look back and say, this is what we used to do. This is how things were. Maybe things are changing. Maybe things are static. But as technology changes, as we age, as the pastures and rangelands age, we can keep track of that a little bit better. Keep track of species that come and go and make decisions accordingly. Plus, record keeping is just good business management, right? If we wanted to, we can use a lot of this stuff that we're putting together. If somebody isn't already involved in NRCS programs, this is a really good start to that seamless integration of NRCS programs that just are better funded. They have a lot more money. And we're trying to find those little spaces between where we can fit in and maximize our impact, not try and replace what the NRCS is already doing. Types of records that are incentivized. I think in most of our sheets, we're looking for, 1 or 2 records. It might be a grazing plan, might be a management plan, might be weather data, could be a map. The more of those that they have, the better scores that they get. Maintenance and infrastructure, all that type of stuff. The next section would be drought management. That's important, and I think I touched on that. Having a plan in place, having those trigger dates so that when it's actually happening, you have something to follow that you can feel good about. We are incentivizing, again, a written drought plan, and who was involved the last time it was reviewed. All these, there's some redundancy here, but what we're looking at is, you know, why do you do what you do? What motivates you to make changes? What motivates you to, you know, keep the status quo? And when these things are written down, you know, the science proves out that, you know, when people make a plan and have a plan to follow, they make better decisions when things start to go awry. And again, there's still points available for an unwritten drought management plan. Drought preparedness and response. You know, this, I just wanted to put this in here because I think this is our only negative point value on the grazing land side of things. It just, there was, you know, -1 point if you weren't responsive in an active declared drought. But drought preparedness is important. You know, you don't want to be waiting to go fix your leaky pipes and your leaky water tanks when water's scarce. You want to make sure that that's all done so that, you know, when water is limited, you can make the best use out of it possible. And monitoring is really the big thing, both long-term and short-term. You know, it influences decision-making, and it tells the producer if what they're doing is working. You know, again, it's only by understanding what's come before that we can make those decisions going forward. And, you know, meeting with the producers that we met with, they were just wonderful. And learning how they decide what they're going to do when they decide it was really unique in every single instance. And how each one of them built resilience into their system was unique as well. So, you know, how does monitoring fit into your goals, both short term and long term, right? Ranchers will tell you they're making decisions day to day, right? They need to move animals. You know, they need to watch their utilization and forage supply versus their demand. That they're looking at animal behavior, right? Are the animals laying down, enjoying what they ate? Are they at the gate ready to move? You know, there's all types of deals that these producers are using to determine their you know, day-to-day, week-to-week goals. And so that short-term monitoring is important. The long-term monitoring, the interpreting indicators of rangeland health or CRMI, line point intercept, things like that, those can really tell us long-term, you know, what's trending in the system. Maybe they're trying to improve ground cover, and they can figure that out. Or, you know, one of the producers we were looking at wanted to increase winter fat, so, you know, he came up with a plan to increase winter fat on his range. Monitoring really is the heavy lifter on influencing what the decision making is going to be going forward. And again, this goes back to, you know, you're going to hear it a lot, the reference site, right? What's the reference condition? What does stuff look like in your area so that we can compare apples to apples and not apples to oranges? And I'll wrap that up so that Helen can start with some technical assistance, and we can get wrapped up and get you guys out of here.
Sorry about that, guys. So